Hello Bobcats, Mr. Buckman here. Today's video is going to be about narrative writing, something that is known as sequence or sequencing. And today we'll be discussing both linear and non-linear sequences, okay? This applies to our writing groups, but is also an important aspect of our reading groups as well, especially in reading the Egypt game, okay? Now, before we talk about this concept, it's very important for us to actually clarify what we mean by a plot. Now, you all know what a plot is, but let's look at the official definition here. A plot is the main sequence. And when you see this word sequence, you can just kind of think of order, okay? The main sequence of events in a story, okay? And the reason that sequence is so important is because an author needs to make sure to get the attention of the reader who is reading what they have written, okay? Harry Potter would not be a very good book if book one started off with Harry Potter defeating Voldemort. Everybody would agree, if you picked up Harry Potter, if you found out that Voldemort was the main bad guy, and on page 4 he kills Voldemort, we don't want to read Harry Potter anymore, do we? So there's a very, very important reason that we talk about sequence and events, because we want to write stories, and I would guess you want to read stories that are compelling and that keep our interest, okay? We want to learn just enough about the story to keep us moving and for us to want to get to the very end of the book where there will generally be some sort of surprise or some sort of resolution to the entire story, okay? Now, there are going to be two main ways that you can move from plot point to plot point in this sequence of events, in this sequence, okay? And the main thing would, two main ways that we can move forward in a story, and that is through events, okay? Like, you might have a chapter where you need to have Joey get to a hospital. Well, one way we can have Joey get to a hospital is for Joey to break his foot, right? Okay? So we can have the event of Joey breaking his foot as the event that would move us to the next plot point, which would be Joey in the hospital. We don't know what Joey needs to do in the hospital, but perhaps the author needs to have the setting be a hospital for the next major plot point. Okay? Another way that we can move a story or a plot forward is through dialogue. People talking with one another. We're going to discuss that in coming weeks. That's not going to be a discussion for today, but that would be another way for you to move your plot forward, okay? Now, what do we mean by forward? What do we mean by forward when we have a story that starts and ends at a certain point? What do we mean by forward? Well, for stories of action, adventure, or mystery, which will be your writing assignment, a short story mystery, it is very important to structure the plot around a conflict. A conflict, okay? And what do I mean by conflict? Well, a conflict could be a problem that occurs, okay? I believe in your lessons for writing, I have listed, this could be something very trivial, like somebody stole your fruit snacks, and you have to figure out who stole my fruit snacks, okay? That might be more of a comedy, that might be more of a funny story, but there is still a conflict or a problem that has occurred that the characters in the story need to figure out, and that the reader needs to figure out as well, okay? And that's kind of what that's what we mean by moving forward. We build our characters, we build our setting, we build our plot, but to move forward, we have to eventually get to a conflict of some point and eventually solve that conflict and resolve all the major issues with that conflict, okay? Now, for these conflicts, the reason that I bring this up, a conflict, a problem, just like we talked about Harry Potter, okay? if we found out that Voldemort was the bad guy, and within just the first couple of pages of Harry Potter, he defeats Voldemort, we wouldn't be interested enough to read the rest of the book, okay? Unless they gave us some reason to move forward, okay? And it's similar with conflicts or problems in a narrative story. For readers to be involved in the story, there usually has to be a problem that the characters or something occurring within a setting, a problem that needs to be solved, okay? Or a conflict, like perhaps two brothers that are at war with one another, okay? These are the kind of things that bring readers into a book and make a book interesting in the first place. You must have conflict. You must have a problem in order for your narrative writing to pique the interests of the people that are reading your story. This is very important, okay? So how do we build this conflict? How do we build this tension, this rising action? Well, I've got a little bit of a diagram here for you, okay? And I'll need to read along with this as well, too. But it's important that we know some terminology and kind of follow this general guideline for what's known as a story arc. A story arc. Now, this will be followed whether we use a linear sequence or a non-linear sequence, and I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second, okay? But first thing we have to talk about what's known as the beginning of a story. Very important. We've got to start it off, right? You can't have the Bible without the book of Genesis, and you can't have the Harry Potter series without learning about Harry Potter. You got to start at the beginning, right? You got to build the world of Hogwarts. You've got to build the characters of Hermione and Ron Weasley, things like that, right? The beginning is also known as the exposition of a story, okay? And when we have beginnings or expositions, this would be where we would introduce characters, okay? We would also introduce things like setting. And when I say setting, what I mean is where does the story take place, okay? Also, you sometimes want to set up a situation of some sort. You can start building this action that will lead eventually to a conflict or a problem of some sort right off the bat. You can start right off the bat with this. Like, for instance, a lot of science fiction novels, when they write about some sort of future where everything's very bleak, sometimes they have to paint the picture and give you the problem right away so you understand what's happening in that world, okay? Also, what will happen inside of the beginning or the exposition, you also sometimes need to put what's known as a hook. Something that's going to catch the reader's interest. Something that stands out from other books or other stories. Something that will make them want to read the rest of the story. Okay? Now you'll see I've got kind of a hill that is building up to the very top here and eventually coming down. After you've started the beginning of your story, it's very important that you build rising action, okay? Build rising action. You might have a character fall ill to a disease. You might have a character that's been murdered, and we have to figure out what happened to that character. You might have two characters that are fighting with one another, okay? We can also build rising action within our setting. For instance, if your setting is a mountain, you can build rising action by it actually being a volcano and then starting to erupt. That's a big problem, wouldn't you say? We can also take the situation that we began the story with and build action, rising action, so the reader is kind of becoming more and more anxious about what's going to happen, okay? Now, the top of this hill, we're just going to call this the middle for right now, okay? But this also is where we're going to put most of our elements of our conflict or our problem and kind of really tease out all the major elements of that conflict or of that problem, okay? And the conflict becomes clear and characters struggle with it in a series of events, we already called that rising action, that lead up to what's known as a climax, okay? This would be the very top of this hill here. The major thing that changes everything. This is sometimes the kind of information that you might call a spoiler alert, something that you didn't know at the beginning of the story, and once you've learned it, it changes not only the entire story, but it also changes the nature of that conflict or that problem that you have introduced to the reader, okay? This is sometimes known as the turning point of the story. But you don't want everything to be resolved right here in the climax, because we still have another half of the book, maybe not that much, but quite a bit of the book or the story to finish off, okay? So if we keep on going, I also want to mention that this would be the most tense part of the story. This would be the most exciting part of the story. This would be the most surprising part of the story. And in a mystery, this might be where the most important clue or the last clue is discovered. In a mystery, we might not have actually solved who did the crime or what happened with the crime or who's guilty of what. We might not have solved the mystery quite yet, but we are given the most important clue in everything that we need in order to solve that mystery. Okay? Now, after you've had your climax, your middle, your tension, your excitement, the culmination of all of your action, it's also important to have falling action as well too, okay? You can still have events that occur in this part that are exciting and full of tension, but it is important that we're starting to wrap things up, and the major conflict or problem, it might not be solved, we might not have a solution for it, but we're in the process of solving it. We're in the process of coming up with a solution for that problem by including falling action. And falling action is usually the last series of events that brings a plot to a close. Okay? Now, the last part of this we'll call the end or the resolution. Okay? The last series of events, the falling action leading into the end, will bring the plot to a close. The conflict is fully resolved right here. The mystery is explained. And the final outcome for the main characters becomes clear. Okay? Now, we have actually seen this in the Egypt game. We've seen this already. We're building characters, the setting, the situation. But one thing I will tell you is we have not reached the middle or the climax of the story. We'll get to that, and hopefully some of you in the reading group will understand what that point is. Now, this is the part of the video where I would like to discuss the difference between linear and non-linear sequencing, the order of your events, okay? And for this, I'm going to use some boards here at the bottom, and I'd like to put them in the same places that I have my story arc, okay? And we're just going to move through a day in chronological order. Every 2 hours, there is a major thing that happens. And I'm not really going to go into this story. Can we see all of the boards there? Let me move this one down just a little bit. There we go. Looks like we can see them all now. Okay. Let me bring this down just a little bit here so you can see what's going on. Okay. So let's just consider this story arc for this very boring story I have down here at the bottom, okay? At 8 o'clock, you have breakfast. You can see that I list breakfast right here, okay? Now, we need to build some rising action and eventually get to the climax, right? It might actually be a little bit more like that. Okay, so you see on the news that there's been an unsolved murder, okay? In your neighborhood, there has been an unsolved murder, and you have no clue who it is, and you've taken it upon yourself to try to figure out who committed that murder. Let's say at 12 p.m., you get your first clue to solve this murder, okay? We're not going to talk about the clue. We're not going to talk about who got murdered. I'm just trying to show you a linear sequence. 2 o'clock, we're going to have a late lunch, okay? Late lunch, grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup. All right, 4 o'clock, we've got clue number 2 here, okay? You get a second clue, and that's going to be an important clue to figure it out. Now, we do have falling action here. I probably would have wanted to have the clue a little bit earlier to build the rising action, but you'll see by 6 p.m. we are eating dinner and the mystery has been solved. Okay, thank you very much. That is my mystery story. However, this is a linear sequence. The reason this is a linear sequence is because it goes in chronological order. It does not move out of order. I start at 8 in the morning and I end at 6 in the evening, and none of these events chronologically occur before the other one. Now this is all fine. But when we create a beginning of our story, it might be important to have that murder right off the bat. So perhaps I can actually start off at 10 o'clock right off the bat with the murder, okay? What am I going to do with my 8 o'clock breakfast, though? Let's put that aside for another time, okay? Now, we know that we can't solve the mystery, which is dinner. We can't make that be the second thing in our plot. But we can also make it so it's not the very last thing as well, too, if we wanted to. So let's say after we got the news of the murder, we skip to a chapter where it jumps from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. and we get clue number 2. Perhaps clue number 2 is not as important as clue number 1, okay? So you want to put that one out there first, okay? Then let's say clue 1 is actually the most important clue. That will be part of your climax here. So now we have the murder and both of the clues occurring before any of the falling action whatsoever, okay? Now, we might, at that point, go back to breakfast at the very beginning of the morning where we didn't even know that there was a murder occurring. But we can go back to breakfast and remember perhaps something that they heard on the radio or something that might help them solve that murder mystery. Let's go ahead and make part of our falling action. We'll make that mystery solved. Now you'll notice, solve the mystery. We have both of the clues, but this is not the last item, right? Well, I can finish this up by having my late lunch, my grilled cheese and tomato soup be the very end of my book. This is what's known as a non-linear sequence. The reason it's not linear is because it starts at 10 a.m. in the morning, it goes to 4 o'clock p.m., it goes to 12 p.m., it goes all the way back to breakfast at 8 a.m., then we move from the very beginning of the day to the very end of our day to 6 p.m., and then we go backwards once again to our late lunch. This might not be the kind of sequence that you would want to have in your short story, but this is something you can do. I mentioned this, and it probably would be best for you to just go in the order linear so you don't get confused. This is the most common, linear sequences are the most common type of sequences for narrative writing. And this will probably be easiest for you, okay? However, if for instance, you're going in a linear fashion and then you remember, you know what, there was a clue I was supposed to include, but I forgot to do it in this chapter, you can go back and put that earlier on in the day. You can move back and forth. You are the author and you have the power to time travel within your own story. Okay? So, I've got one quick example of this from the Egypt game, okay? Because sometimes an author will give out a lot of information and then they'll backtrack and say, this is what was happening 3 months ago. If you turn to page 34 in the Egypt game, you'll see the second full paragraph. It all started when April found a new book about Egypt. An especially interesting one about the life of a young pharaoh, okay? They mention that this is actually occurring before she goes to school, and this is out of order, so that chapter is part of a non-linear sequence, okay? Well, I hope you all understand linear and non-linear sequencing, what we mean by plot and what we mean by sequences. As the events that occur in a story, the order of them is up to you. Have a great day.